What is up, you guys? Welcome to The Meaning Of, where we talk about your favorite filmmakers and the deeper meanings within their films. I'm Sabrina Ramirez, and I'm here with my co-host RB3. And today we're welcoming special guest. You all know him, you all love him, John Rocha.
Thank you. I don't know if they all love me, but I'm glad they tuned in. I'm excited to be here with you all. And, you know, people talked about subscribing it. Well, I thought I'd finally come on The Meaning Of podcast. So I'm excited to be here. And RB3 and I have been trying to negotiate this for about a year. So finally, it's kind of worked out, and I'm excited to come on here. And I will say this ahead of time, because we're talking about Akira Kurosawa. Paul Oyama, if you're listening to this or watching this, if I make a mistake, I'm sorry. I'll say that ahead of time. But I'm excited to get into it today.
Yeah, we're excited to have you today. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we're talking Akira Kurosawa. So super excited. I'm not as familiar with his filmography as I believe that you two are. So I'm kind of excited to hear about it, hear your guys' conversation on it, because it's something that I've always wanted to dive into. And I do have the Criterion channel now. Yeah. So I'm excited about that. So yeah, let's get it started. RB3?
Yeah, no. I'm super excited about this. Kurosawa is one of my absolute favorites to just watch in film school. And again, we talked about it with Paul Oyama when he came on for the Luca Guadagnino. Guadagnino, yeah. When he came on for that episode, and how, just like through film school, you get introduced to a whole lot of stuff that are really the fundamentals of cinema. So yeah, this when you watch a lot of Kurosawa's filmography, pretty much going through like most of his films, you watch his movies and you see what kind of specific influences they have on further movies down the line. We're going to talk about Seven Samurai, but if there's no Seven Samurai, there would not be an Avengers. If there wasn't Hidden Fortress, there wouldn't be a Star Wars. If there wasn't, if there wasn't Yojimbo, there wouldn't be A Fistful of Dollars. Like, there's just so much of his filmography that kind of laid the blueprint for the next 50 years of cinema going past that. And I just think it's really remarkable and incredible.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to think about when you look at it, because I know a lot of people like to see, a lot of people like, if it's in black and white, I don't watch it, blah, blah, blah. But there is so much to go back and enjoy from Kurosawa's early stuff, even the stuff that's not available on Blu-ray. If you can find DVDs of The Bad Sleep Well, or if you can find Redbeard, there's so many great films that he directed that aren't even the ones people talk about the most. He's almost like the Beatles, where everyone knows the hits, but there's like so many more just beyond the hits that are just as good, if not better. And they're special jewels for those of us who are massive fans of Kurosawa to catch on TCM late at night at like 1 a.m. and watch, or to find in the DVDs, in the DVD section of Barnes and Noble and pick up and buy. There's so much to enjoy about his stuff. There's so much of the themes throughout, so much about the technique, and also like the time he took in building and constructing these scripts so that he'd have the optimal film possible from that experience. And also, if you look at the man and his history, he was uber successful right out of the gate when he started directing films, and then had this massive depression to the point of suicide, and then bounced back towards the end of his life to direct two of his greatest masterpieces. And then, of course, had one last one in Rhapsody in August and passed. So there's so much to enjoy in Kurosawa. And I think anybody who's getting into film can find a film to love from Kurosawa's complete oeuvre.
Yeah. And, I think that to me, like, I remember being in high school and watching, Every Frame of Painting. That was, the popular video essay channel, and they did an episode on Kurosawa's and the movement in his films, and that's always something that stuck out to me. Like, even before even being totally familiar with his filmography, I still appreciated just what his work represented, to the technique of cinema, just from a video essay. So then we actually take the deep dive into each individual film and each individual story. It just becomes so much better.
It's really crazy how he's had such a impactful career, where he's talked about in regards as one of the best filmmakers of all time. Yeah. And it's iconic. The consistency with quality in his films is there. That's what everybody kind of celebrates. And, as RB3 said, it inspired George Lucas and subsequent directors to kind of make the films that they did that also had a big impact. So to be the kind of first person to start it out and people following in suit from there, it's definitely a really, really special thing.
And not even at a time when foreign film directors were necessarily, I mean, it was like from Japan, right? Everyone was in love with, eventually they fell in love with the French stuff or Italian waves, or even the Russian from the early 20s and 30s, those influencing film as well, or the German stuff from the 20s, Dr. Caligari, I think there's a lot of stuff from there's a lot of stuff that influenced what we would see later noir in the 40s and 50s here in America. But something like Japanese cinema was not necessarily something that was even looked at or revered or even considered, of course, because of the war and all of that happened. His films coming out post-World War II, it's pretty incredible that they found a positive response in the 1950s here in America and in the 60s. Because remember, we were interning Japanese Americans in camps in the 40s out of fear for the Japanese. So the fact that we opened the door and they attacked us in Pearl Harbor. So the fact that the American movie-going public opened their doors and opened their eyes to appreciate Kurosawa's work after it was, praised globally at international festivals speaks volumes about his effect on people and how his work transcended that kind of stuff that maybe would have normally stopped a less excellent filmmaker.
And I think a big part of it, like you said, comes down to society and the impact of politics and whatnot. Because after Japan was bombed post Pearl Harbor and all of that, they actually agreed to a Western to join the alliance, and the United States actually, partially out of guilt, but a lot of about global responsibility, they came in and helped restructure a lot of the Japanese economy and the Japanese government. So then in doing that, there was a big economic boom, and it created like this kind of developing new film space that was kind of coming out of Japan during that time. And a lot of people, some Japanese critics have actually criticized Akira Kurosawa because they feel like a lot of his work is very influenced by like John Ford and the Westerns that kind of came out of America during the 1940s and 50s. So I think a lot of his films had much more crossover success because of the influences that they embodied, and because there's kind of a shared language amongst the filmmaking and the cinema, regardless of the language. There's sort of a shared ideology that came through across his filmography.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like if you're the top dog, they're always going to come after you. No matter what field you're in, they're always going to come after you. They're always going to be jealous of your success. They're always going to have issues with how you do things because you're not doing it their way, and they're doing it the way they think is correct. And why are they not having the same success? And Kurosawa, you're right, RB3, to bring that up, suffered a lot at the hands of other Japanese directors, Japanese film goers. They claimed his films were too westernized, even though he set them during samurai warlord times or set them within the modern times at Japanese companies. He tried really hard to set them in actual relatable Japanese history or Japanese modern culture, but tried to make their themes universal, tried to make their themes, his themes rather universal, his themes relatable across the globe. And there was and you can't deny, there's just sometimes people just have that it. Certain directors have that it, and they get it and they understand it, and it becomes global. And it wasn't like he was making Adam Sandler films that everyone was laughing about, or Jim Carrey films. These are incredible pieces of cinema that were able to permeate numerous countries. And for whatever reason, his style of doing it, and there are a number of X factors involved here, was able to connect in large ways with a lot of people around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's honestly like my favorite part about exploring his filmography as a film school student, is understanding how universal cinema could be just in general. And there's and thankfully, because of the era of streaming that we live in, we're able to access a lot of his films a lot easier. We're just talking about the Criterion channel, right? Like they have, I think, almost every single one of his films available on there, if not all of them, except for a couple. Yeah, so they have that, and they also have a lot of complimentary materials. Like they have a documentary on there called a message from Kurosawa, and then it's like a lot. I think it came out in 2000, like after he died, but it features a lot of interviews of him and a lot of him talking about the process of his filmmaking. So like all of those. So thankfully, as a film school student, now, even if you can't afford film school, even if you don't go to film school, you still have access to a lot of the cinema because of the era of streaming. And if you familiar yourself with a lot of this stuff, you can really understand how universal, like you said, John, how universal movies could be in general, how global movies could be in general.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sabrina.
Oh no, yeah, I was just gonna say, if you guys want to get started on the first film.
Yeah, we could jump into our first. We're gonna kind of, since he has I believe he has exactly 30 films. We are going to just boil it down to 6 essentials that we are going to kind of talk about and give our kind of perspective as to like the kind of impact and the kind of deeper meanings into them. Those films are going to be Rashomon, Ikiru, Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, High and Low, and Ram. So we're gonna, and obviously towards the end we're gonna talk about a lot more of his films. We have that little special shout out segment that we have towards the end, so we'll be able to talk more then. But let's just jump into Rashomon. This movie came out in 1950, and it is the story of a murder mystery that kind of is told from a number of different perspectives. This is actually the first film school movie I watched through film school. And it deals, and largely because it deals with the idea of authorship, right? And it deals with the idea of like who's telling the story and how a perspective on a story could change the way it's told, and how you could tell the same exact story 4 different ways and you could get 4 totally different results. So I really, really appreciate this movie. This is one of those quintessential movies that I think everybody should be going out there and watching. And yeah, what are your overall thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's a disturbing film because of what goes on there and the accusations of rape in 1950 in a film, a Japanese film like this, the accusations of rape that go on, as well as the murder accusations, and each one having their point of view. Now, remember, Citizen Kane in 1941 comes out, right? And that's everyone's point of view except Kane's, right? This idea of Kane never speaks for himself. Everyone remembers what Kane says, but we're only seeing it through their eyes, and Kurosawa took that concept and went next level with Rashomon, because he's talking about one specific event. And we've seen numerous films copy this concept going forward afterwards, but this is the one that people come back to because it's so well done. You invest in each of the stories as they go along, so much so by the end you're questioning what the truth is yourself. Like, I believed this person, but then I listened to this one, like, oh yeah, I could see it that way. And it's just such a lesson for all of us that 5 people can be looking at something at the same time and have 5 completely different interpretations, completely different points of view on it, and think they're the victim or they're the lead of the story. So I think that's what's so essential about here. And he doesn't waste time in telling these stories. They're very tight within each person's recollection, and I appreciate that. He doesn't dilly-dally or dawdle too much on a particular thing. Whatever's in the frame, whatever's being spoken about, it is essential as a counter to what was spoken about before. So it asks a lot of you when you're watching it to remember the facts and remember how to put them together for you, or maybe not facts, but how to put them together in your head of the story by the time it's done.
Yeah. That's really interesting that it's told from the perspective of, I believe, 4 characters. Yeah, 4. Yeah, that's a really interesting, like, great storytelling device. So I'm looking forward to checking that out on Criterion Channel.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely something worth checking out. And again, it adds to the conversation of authorship, and it kind of is like this metatextual idea of like how a director can interpret things and their conversations. One of the most powerful scenes is towards the end with the baby and the whole rain environment. We haven't even talked about like the techniques that Kurosawa uses in his storytelling, right? The idea of weather, of nature, of wind, of rain. We just had our throwback episode posted of our Ang Lee conversation that we had about a year and a half ago. And with Ang Lee, it's like this, he has a similar usage of movement and weather and wind to communicate like this kind of storytelling. But yeah, I mean, but after Rashomon obviously was a huge hit, and I think it participated in the Venice Film Festival back when it came out. After that, he had another big one, Ikaru, that came out in 1952. That film, it follows a bureaucrat who is trying to kind of rediscover himself, trying to understand how to cope with society after he finds out he is diagnosed with cancer, as opposed to Rashomon, which is set during the samurai age. This is one of the not few, but one of the kind of more unique films in Akira's filmography where it's set in contemporary times. And it's about this guy who's literally trying so hard to reason with his family, the people in his life, to he doesn't tell his children initially, and they kind of spite him and think he's having this affair. And there's all of these different like emotional plot lines, and it all culminates into this really powerful and impactful film that ends with this like 2-minute long singing. I'm not sure exactly what the song is, but it's really, really beautiful. So, I mean, John, what are your thoughts on Ikaru?
Yeah, Ikaru is one of those ones that I had to kind of take some time with, because for whatever reason, I have a proclivity for samurai films. So Kurosawa was someone I just went to for samurai films. And it wasn't until later that I started to expand my acceptance and appreciation of Kurosawa by going into more of his thoughtful ruminations on life films. And certainly Akira is one of them, right? And it's almost 3 hours, if not 3 hours. And it is a slow burn, and you've got to have the patience for it. But within the slow burn, once you understand what's happening here, is you see this man who is basically a number. Remember Metropolis, when people are just marching into the thing? That's what society at that time, or what a lot of people at that time in the Japanese society were feeling about themselves. This idea of this technological this technological advancement. And so everybody had jobs, but everybody became a number. And, you go to Japan, you go to Tokyo, you go to those big condensed cities. I was just watching Inception last night. They have that helicopter shot, and it's like all these buildings are literally on top of each other, and you start to feel like you're just a number, right? You're just a bunch of rats going into one place, and there's no individuality. And what Ikiru does is pull this, what would normally just be a very unremarkable life that ends the way it ends, a guy working his job up until his death and it's done. It pulls it out and it goes, no, if you just stop for a second and stop worrying about just driving to work and working at my job and coming home and doing this and then getting up and doing it all over again. If you don't take a moment to appreciate your life or life itself, you will get lost and you will just become a number, and your life will be unremarkable, and you won't understand or appreciate or have the beautiful moments of exploring your world around you and having it touch you and you touch it, right? I mean, the woman he's helping, he's taking the risk of being, like you said, RB3, insulted by his family, accused, all this kind of stuff. And all he's trying to do is help this woman and help them like kind of achieve a certain level of existence that is better than the existence he had. And it's his last gift to the world, like a universal gift to the world. As he's dying of stomach cancer, it's going back. And when he sits on the swing, it's him regressing all the way back to being a child again and remembering all the possibilities of life before he became just a number at a corporation in a big room and with no real individuality, right? It's this moment. That's what I thought was beautiful about the film. And I think, and let me tell you, I saw it when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. I got it, didn't really get it till I saw it in my 40s. As you get closer to like glimpsing the fact that you're going to die at some point, like it's a really believable thing now, as opposed to when you're young, like you two, and the world's out there for you to have. When you get older, you really start to go like, okay, well, what have I done? What have I left? Who have I touched? Have I moved enough people? Did I have human moments with people? And, will people remember me? Those things start to kind of go into your head as you get older. And Ikiru is that what happens to men and women as they get older and they kind of hit that twilight. What has been my effect on my world? Did I leave something positive in the world with my time? And him sitting on that swing, I think just encapsulates all of that in that 2-minute moment in the song you were talking about.
Wow, that sounds beautiful.
It is.
Gosh.
Yeah, no, John, I don't even know how to follow that, bro. Like,
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
he totally wrapped up the film.
love him.
I'm sure
Yeah.
Kurosawa would appreciate that breakdown.
Well,
but yeah,
thank you.
But that's real life though. And you know what? And with, you're kind of talking about how, and especially at this time in Japanese society, there was kind of like this, like we said, this rapid economical boom that was kind of quickly advancing. I mean, people don't realize this, but for a lot of the early 20th century, Japan was still very traditional. It was still very like, there's still a lot of big fields with not a lot of industry and all that kind of stuff. The Industrial Revolution was kind of coming during the 1950s. On top of that, there's already this anxiety of technology because of the bombs and because of the societal circumstances that led to the position that people are at now. So it's kind of like this transition of guard that just kind of happened really rapidly. So it affected people, and this movie kind of captures that anxiety really well. And there's also something to be said about, again, some cultural critics and analysis have also attributed the least character's terminal cancer to be something that's linked to the radiation and the chemicals that kind of leaked from the bombing of Hiroshima and all that kind of stuff. So, and it plays into another whole discussion about generational trauma, of generational suffering at the hands of all of this stuff. So really, this movie kind of touches on a lot of subjects that are really deep and really profound. And I think a lot of people consider Ikiru to be, if not one of Kurosawa's best, if not the best, one of his best. And I totally agree with that as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing you touched on there is the transition of generations, right? The fact that Japan was moving from traditional society that it had before to a more westernized, economic, industrial revolution type society. The kids were becoming pampered, that they were able to have certain things that the generation before, and this is all cyclical, this is a circle of life. The kids were being, so they show his kids being spoiled and thinking that they deserve all this stuff. And he helps the young woman because she isn't that way, because he knows that she'll carry on his legacy better than his kids will, and that happened. And Tokyo Story is another film. It's not a Kurosawa film. That's also a film about an older couple going to visit their ungrateful kids and what they experience along the way and while they're there. So there are a number of Japanese films around this time that are exploring how the older generation is being, pushed aside by the younger generation with no respect and no appreciation. And unfortunately, that cycle repeats itself all the time. There's so much we can learn from people who've come before us to teach us about the mistakes that we make when we're young. But when you're young, you don't want to listen. That's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, no, that's real life. And we try to listen. I
don't.
So cut out those old jokes, you a-holes. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
That's not for this show. Yeah.
Anyway.
But post Ikaru, of course, we move back into another samurai picture, and that's Seven Samurai, which came out in 1954. Now this I consider to be the ultimate ensemble movie, and it kind of set the standard for ensemble movies. Like I said, just going to like the more obvious references, like Avengers, like A Bug's Life, I think is literally credited as a remake of Seven Samurai, and the westerns that it inspired, the numerous westerns that it inspired, that kind of team up with obviously the Magnificent Eight and all that kind of stuff. The Magnificent Eight. Yeah, there it is. Hateful Eight, the Magnificent Seven. Yeah, all of that. All directly coming from Seven Samurai. And outside of like the obvious kind of banding together storyline that's created, also kind of structured a lot of ideals that would come into play in the hero's journey story. I talk about the hero's journey story a lot on this podcast, but like the idea of, you know, having to deal with sacrifice and loss, and the whole, you know, end of second act break where one of the mentor characters ends up dying, and you kind of thrusted into a new position of fully understanding the responsibility that you entail. It all culminates into this one really beautiful film that ended up inspiring so many generations after that. So, Mr. John Rocha, what's your take on Seven Samurai?
Well, I mean, for the majority of my life, since I was maybe 16, 17 years old, Citizen Kane was my number one film. It always has been. But the only other film that has given it a run for its money as I've gotten older is Seven Samurai. It is maybe my favorite film ever made. Again, this side of Kane, because there's so much involved in this, and it's a 3-hour samurai film. That is legitimately a 3-hour samurai film, but it is peppered with such incredible characters that all get their time to shine. With some, you spend more time with them. With others, you spend less time with them. But you understand and know all these characters as they represent 7 different personalities in the world. The stoic swordsman, the temperamental kid who wants to be a samurai because his parents were killed by samurais, so he's become what he beheld. The calm leader that has experienced all the things and is still humble. His friend, who is just a joyful energy to have around. The more relaxed samurai that is also quick with a smile, but also suspicious of the world. So there's so many different personalities all throughout. And then the young villager, the young samurai who falls in love with a villager, like all of that is represented here. And then we see this nobility within them because they're defending people who can't fight for themselves, who are scared to fight for themselves. There's these, they're coming in. They're essentially, this outside group comes in to steal food from them, to steal it. But essentially, they're turning them into, in essence, it's almost a colonization situation where they're turning that village into an extension of their criminal empire. They're going to go and take what they need when they want to take what they need, and you're just going to shut up and take it. And for once, they hire these noble soldiers to fight back. But within that society, and this is the gift of the movie, he does not let the society be just this good people. They're all just like, really nice people who hired a samurai. No, they're suspicious of the samurai as well. They're skeptical. They hide their women from the samurai because they're afraid the samurai are going to rape their women or try to take their women out of the village. Other samurai have come to help them, which they don't tell them before, and have died in the process. So they've taken their armor and hid it away. So there's a lot of shame within the village. And then at the end, you have to kind of reckon with this idea that, well, these people have to survive. So you putting this idea of good versus evil on them in a simplistic way is not the truth and not the reality of the world. He showed the ugly truth of society, but also the noble things that society can be, and also what can happen when people come in to help their fellow man. Yes, there are deaths in the movie in the defense of that village, but the deaths are all noble and for the right reasons. And then you see what happens as this horde of villains trying to take everything, how they start to turn in on themselves once things get hairy and tough. So what you thought were this overwhelming force that you could never defeat, as soon as you killed 4, 5, 6 of them, all of a sudden they're turning on each other. So they were never as strong as you thought, and you were never as weak as you thought. So it's just like that kind of thing that we create the perception of what our world is and what we're strong in and what we're weak at by our own mind. And I thought all of that's operating underneath the surface of the action as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of why that movie has such an influence on the way characters kind of interact in a dynamic sense. Now, obviously, a lot of Kurosawa's style kind of evolves from, or at least a lot of his staging and his blocking and his composition kind of resemble a lot of theater, right? Like a lot of dynamic movements between characters and blocking that kind of represent each different stages of like emotions and feelings. So I think when you set these characters all in this kind of environment where tension is boiling, even on the good guy side and the bad guy side. He does a really good job throughout the scenes emphasizing the way that their dynamics are all kind of playing off of each other. Even individual people have individual tics and individual movements that kind of assign them this, this kind of persona that they follow up with their entire film. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Kurosawa said, or I believe his daughter actually said that a couple of generations removed, a couple of generations back, behind Kurosawa were actual samurais in his family. So he takes a lot of personal, I believe in his family, they had a lot of personal value of the codes and the principles of samurai. And you kind of see a lot of those represented in this film too. The idea of the noble death, the idea of the sacrifice, the idea of serving the greater good as opposed to oneself. I think that is a core principle that is applied throughout this entire film. And as opposed to something that we're going to talk about after the break, Yojimbo, which is about a Ronin who's a masterless samurai, and that presents violence in a little more of a, for lack of a better term, cynical sensibility. But in this film, it feels very purposeful. It feels very honorable. It feels very ingrained into the overall cultural dynamic that's happening within this small village. And, especially, now especially now in the lens of like 2020, we look at a film like this where it is this kind of poor village that is in need of help, of a greater sacrifice, and how initially there's that kind of like resistance towards authority, and how there's that kind of like, because there's always been a terrible relationship between people from lower classes or people who are undervalued and their relationship to authority. But this film kind of shows how that trust and that repertoire was kind of built between the villagers and the samurai group.
Yeah, and even the villagers have to confront the fact, well, some of them do, when their homes are going to be burned in order to save the whole, and those villagers get upset at the other villagers, and they were so gung-ho to have the samurai come, but when they have to sacrifice their homes, then all of a sudden they don't understand the logic of it, or they don't want to believe, they want to go and go out and stay in their homes. And that is when Takashi Shimura's character pulls out the sword and for the first time ever in the film threatens the villagers with death himself, because he understands if we let those villagers leave the main area, they will cause an opening in the wall that will end up killing everybody, or killing maybe all the samurai and some of the villagers as well. So he cannot allow any of that. So once again, it's that idea of sometimes you have to sacrifice the thing you value most in order to survive overall within our society. So not poking holes, but exploring the concepts of the positives and the negatives of a society and what is asked of you. And are you ready to lay down the ultimate sacrifice to maintain the good, the overall good, the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few.
All right. Thank you guys so much for listening to the first half of the discussion. Stay tuned, because after the break, RB3 and John Rocha will be talking some more of Kurosawa's filmography.
This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. With the 4/5 divide you in half. You getting at me equals a bloodbath. You do the math, take you out the equation.
Check out our review of the new HBO film Bad Education starring Hugh Jackman, available exclusively on First Cut. Enjoy.
Sabrina, you just finished it. I want to have your hot take right now.
Hot take. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. I believe his name is Corey Finley. Has impressed me both with Thoroughbreds and this one. I think he's a really cool, interesting filmmaker to look out for. I don't know if he's done any other stuff I'd be familiar with, but I think I really enjoyed both. I love the performances. I love the ensemble. That was probably like my favorite part. Even a lot of the supporting cast who like weren't really in it for as long and stuff like that. I think they all kind of made a big splash. And of course, Hugh Jackman is incredible. I think not that I'm happy that he's not Wolverine anymore, but I'm happy that we can get performances like this out of him as well, that kind of are like something different out of that, as much as I loved him as Wolverine. And Allison Janney is always always great in every single thing she does. Like, she could literally, you know what? I want her to be president. I want to vote. That's my hot take. I want Allison Janney to be president because she is a baddie. I was going to say bad B, but I'm going to censor myself, so I'll just say baddie.
Come along, children. Now we're going to have a little music.
Welcome back, guys. Again, we're here with John Rocha talking Kurosawa's filmography, and next up we have Yojimbo.
Yeah, Yojimbo is, I believe it came out in 1961, and is largely credited as the primary influence for Sergio Leone's Fistful of Dollars, and it actually set a lot of the quintessential formula for the kind of lonely warrior / cowboy kind of aesthetic that we kind of see in a lot of today's films. This movie, it's about a Ronin who is an independent, and at least he calls himself a Yojimbo, which is really bodyguard, but in the greater sense of the historical context, he's a Ronin, right? He's masterless. He doesn't have a master. He doesn't serve anything. He's just a lonely soldier. And he kind of drifts into this town that really is struggling and really dangerous. And there's a pending like civil war that's happening within the town in and of itself that, and they kind of ask him to come in and help manage. And he's resilient at first, but he manages to come around. And I personally think this is kind of the start of a newer-ish kind of era for Kurosawa. This movie is a lot more violent, I think, than some of his previous films, and it breaks into a lot more of a kind of cynical, it takes the direction of violence and action and samurai and to a more of a critical lens, as opposed to a little bit more of celebratory towards the beginning half of his career. So John, what are your overall thoughts of Yojimbo?
I love Yojimbo. Yojimbo is a fun time. Yeah, you know, most of the times when you're watching Kurosawa's films, it's, you know, there's a lot of ruminations. But there are concepts in here to consider and think about and spend some time with if you want. But if you just want to enjoy a Kurosawa film, Yojimbo is the one to watch. It is so much fun. Toshiro Mifune, no longer the screaming maniac from Seven Samurai. He almost looks like 10 years older, yet this film was only 2 years later. There's just such a power and comfortable, just comfortableness in his skin to him as this character, as this Yojimbo who comes into this town. And the way he even comes into the town at the beginning is just flipping a stick and seeing which path to take when he comes to a fork in the road. The stick falls in a certain way. So none of this movie happens maybe if the stick had fallen on the other path. That's a whole nother story, a whole nother adventure, maybe a whole nother Kurosawa film even. And so he goes down this path, and in the path, he walks into this town, and he's, you know, it's between, like you just mentioned, the Civil War thing, but within it, he is playing against, and this is Kurosawa's rumination on war. The idea of this, it's on the Cold War, Russia versus America. Both sides spooked all the time that the other side is going to do something. Both sides, you know, like having spies that they have to negotiate releases for in exchange for other spies. So, and then, Kurosawa paints Yojimbo as this thing, this entity that come in the middle and make fun of both. So, you know, for all these accusations of him, you know, kind of being too Western and walking away from Japanese traditional society, I've always seen Yojimbo as his smirky answer to those criticisms, you know, because he even gives his future leading man, Tatsuyata Nakadai, this is, I think, his first main introduction here in the film as the guy who has the gun, the brother there who's in there, the brother of the main, one of the main leaders of one of the gangs. He comes in with a gun. That's the westernized thing. The gun. I have the gun. Everyone's afraid of the gun, right? And in the end, it is Yojimbo who cuts his hand off with the gun, or kills him before he can kill him with the gun, and all of that. So, like, so much here to explore if you want to go deeper with it. But overall, it's just a fun film where someone like Yojimbo plays them both against each other and comes close to getting killed himself in these actions. And I think a film like Miller's Crossing is influenced slightly by Yojimbo. I know we talk about Sergio Leone all the time. That's the obvious connection. But Miller's Crossing is very interesting. If you've never seen that, Gabriel Byrne playing both sides because he has an overall goal to get to by the end. And I think in Yojimbo, you see that as well. And it's brilliantly done. And of course, one of the great moments for those who are Kurosawa fans is when Kurosawa first started doing samurai films, he had a different leading actor before Toshiro Mifune. And ironically, all three generations of his leading men are in this film because the older samurai who was defending the one of the gangs there, one of the criminal gangs there, he jumps over the roof and runs away, waves at Toshiro Mifune's character and runs off. He was the original samurai in the first few films that Kurosawa did. So in essence, in the film, he is passing the torch to Toshiro Mifune, and later Toshiro Mifune will leave after Redbeard, and Tatsuyata Nakadai, who's in this film with the gun, he takes over and he's in Ron and all these other films that Kurosawa does. So it's such an interesting film just for that fact alone. It's like a De Niro, DiCaprio film that Scorsese is directing, passing the torch type of thing. So I find that to be fascinating about this movie as well. But overall, just a very fun film. The scenes are very well written. The twists and turns are incredibly believable, even though they can be outlandish at times. And you get a glimpse into of his thoughts about war. Because remember, he lived through the nuclear war, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and his older brother brought him out to look at the bodies and look at the devastation and look at the destruction. He told his brother, he told Akira, I never want you to forget this and what man can do to itself. And of course, his brother was incredibly sensitive and ended up killing himself later in life. But he had been the one that introduced Kurosawa into movies because he had done the narration to movies there in Japan. And so this connection here is very powerful. And I think it comes out. I think this is his kind of like dealing with the grief of the death of his brother in this film a little bit by like making fun of both sides of the American and Russian Cold War situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I never actually caught on to the U.S. and Russia connection there. Yeah, that's a really interesting interpretation. That's my first time hearing of that, but that's really, that's really indicative of what the actions on screen are about, right? Because it's kind of like this conflict over essentially nothing. I mean, it's like, there's kind of like village pettiness / nothingness that kind of leads into the split between these two kind of factions. And I think back to that scene in the beginning where the one side had paid him to be involved, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. And he's just chilling on the roof as those two are literally going back and forth in like this kind of standoff. Like they run towards each other and they run back, and they run towards each other and they run back. And then as soon as they're actually about to engage, the inspector comes through and ends up stopping the whole thing. But it's just really funny how the kind of conflict unfolds throughout this entire film and how it kind of leads to this overall just kind of much more, like I said, cynical, a little more critical evaluation into like the Ronin / samurai character. So I really appreciate it on that level.
Plus it's a great score and his movement throughout the movie, that little shimmy shake that he does is so great.
And that's actually something that I go back to Every Frame of Painting video essay about Kurosawa. He references the Yojimbo character specifically as having like a little something that gives him that, that kind of iconic look and stroke. And if I'm not mistaken, Kurosawa's next film was kind of like a quasi kind of sequel to Yojimbo too. Yeah. So I appreciate what it does on that level. It's kind of like we talk about Fistful of Dollars and Sergio Leone, and like you said, Miller's Crossing, but also like the Mad Max character is also something that kind of spawned from the Yojimbo concept. So really influential stuff there. For me, we could go on to the next one, which is High and Low, which is for me one of my absolute favorites of his. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast, but my favorite genre is like noir and mystery and all of that stuff. And this movie is that, and it's set in contemporary times, and it speaks to an overall message of income inequality and poverty and the disparagement between classes. But yeah, this is actually one of my favorite Kurosawa movies ever. I think it's probably one of his most underrated, in my opinion. But yeah, John, what are your thoughts on High and Low?
Yeah, behind Seven Samurai, this is my number 2 favorite film in the Kurosawa collection of films. Absolutely, I remember distinctly the first time I saw this, and I just like sat back in my chair, and like for an hour, I just kind of sat there afterwards, just thinking about everything that the film presented, because it does. If you get it when you watch it, if you get it, it will hit you like a diamond bullet between your eyes what he's talking about. And like RB3 alluded to, the societal stuff, the class warfare, the income inequality, also the idea that the police will help the rich more than they'll help the poor, the way the poor is treated, the way the rich have to sacrifice certain things, and that the rich themselves, as we just discovered with COVID and coronavirus, are 1 or 2 deals away from losing everything almost all the time. So the tightrope not only exists down at the bottom, it exists at the top as well, just in a different way, you know, because Toshiro Mifune's character is playing this leader of a company, or this owner of a company, and his company is about to go bankrupt unless he does this deal. And if he does this deal, he'll save the company. And yes, he'll have to take a little bit lesser stake in the company and be not as powerful. But just when he's about to close this deal with these investors and get the money he needs, his kid is stolen by this. What we find out later is this poor guy who had watched him, his mansion on the hill for years, and was upset that this gentleman could lord over them, who was rich. And he developed this whole psychosis about him being rich. And so he thought stealing the kid would affect some kind of equality between them. But he ends up taking the wrong kid. He takes the driver's kid. And now the question is, do you pay the money out to save the child of your driver, not your child? Or do you not pay the money out, let your driver's child die, and that's what you build a foundation on of saving your company? So he does the right thing. He does pay the money, but then the cops get involved and they have to find him, and they eventually find the guy. And when they find the guy, the scene that you are building to throughout the entire movie is the scene between Mifune and the young actor who plays the poor kid who is, by the way, a medical student who stole the child. You see them have this final argument between each other, and it is him raging about being poor at this rich man. The problem is his anger is misdirected, because this rich man is actually a noble, good man. He's not what he had created in his head, which drives his madness even worse, into a worser place. And that so much to explore here and savor from Kurosawa in High and Low. And it is, as I think RB3, you're right, it's as close to a noir as you're going to get. And he would do occasional noirs, but this is the closest one that you'll get to a full noir that he does that's actually one of his masterpieces. And by the way, Springsteen wrote a song in Nebraska called Mansion on the Hill that is kind of a reference to this movie as well. This idea of the mansion on the hill representing the ultimate apex of achievement in as you said earlier, RB3, this advent of this economy that instantly created a massive lower class and a gulf in difference between those of the haves and the have-nots. So the have-nots are frustrated, and this kid is a medical student, is so frustrated and looking at that house all the time. He turns the house into some kind of judgment on him and his status and his frustration that he thinks he'll never achieve that. And so he lashes out by stealing the child. And he's, clearly a wild animal at times in that cage, yelling at Mifune's character. But honestly, how many of us who were not born with much? I mean, I didn't come from anything. My parents didn't have a car till I was 2 years old. Like, we came from dirt poor poverty. How many of us have not had those moments when things have fallen apart and we're just kind of frustrated by other people who are achieving effortlessly, it seems like, or doing whatever, and we rage at it in our own hearts because we want to have a shot. We want to be able to succeed as well. So it's a very universal feeling, I think, as well, once again, from Kurosawa within the film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I told everything you said. Again, you just wrapped it all up into a nice little bow there. Yeah, the whole societal conflict of income, right? Like how much that can influence. I mean, we've seen it kind of expressed a lot through a lot of 20th 2019, 2020 films.
Parasite.
Parasite. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Joker.
Yes, Joker.
Ready or Not. All of these movies about class anxiety. This movie kind of touched on that back then. And but it is interesting that we landed on. He ended up stealing the one kid who, or he ended up stealing from the one rich person who actually has morality, who actually cares about this kid who doesn't even belong to him. And frankly, it is kind of sad towards the end when you start to see him lose everything, and the money finally gets back to him, and it's too late. But it's the consequences of high living, at least in the eyes of the medical student. And for me personally, like, I never really would empathize with rich people. I wouldn't really, do that, especially in this case. And in the beginning, he was hesitant. The beginning, he was very, very hesitant. He was going against it. And I want to shout out another video essay from Cinefix called 3 Brilliant Moments of Blocking, where they kind of break down the beginning few scenes of High and Low and kind of illustrate how the blocking in those scenes are so dynamic because they're all inside of that apartment and inside of that living room, and how the blocking kind of highlights and illustrates like the conflict they were all having. But yeah, to me in general, that's one of the most prevalent that's one of the most prevalent things to me, is just like the whole idea of like the moral question, like, do you have to pay for somebody's kid who isn't yours if it's your driver? And obviously the driver looked really weak, and it wasn't like it was just money from Mr. Gordon's personal account. It's literally all of his savings, everything he took out. He mortgaged everything. And so it's a bit different than just like, just some personal wealth. No, it was literally everything he owned he gave away for the sake of that child. So he's a really good moral dude in a society that isn't so moral and adept. And I really found it particularly interesting, the kind of drug angle that kind of comes in at the end of it too, right? Like the opioid hook and the cringe, and the idea of using like withdrawal and heroin withdrawal as a method of murder. And that's kind of what the medical student does in order to put himself in the position of, to orchestrate the kidnapping and all that. I love the fact that this movie, the first hour is about Mr. Gordon and his story, and the second hour is about the cops trying to figure out what all happened here. And they're all kind of leading to this central theme of like you said, division of wealth and the consequences of that. Lastly, I want to throw in for High and Low is that last scene that you talked about where they're at the end having that confrontation. I love how Kurosawa just doesn't cut away from the medical students, shot, no matter, even when the homeboy is like responding, he still holds on that shot, and you could just see this like driving insanity that this character is kind of having, and especially towards Mr. Gordo. So Gordon. And but yeah, so overall everything about High and Low is just absolutely awesome to me. The editing, the cinematography, the pacing, even though it's a little different than the samurai films, and honestly I think it's a little different than a lot of films in Kurosawa's collection, I still really value and appreciate what they're going for there. So
agreed.
Yeah. And the last film we're going to talk about today in our Kurosawa episode is Ran. This one came out much later in his career in 1985. A lot of people consider this like one of his later masterpieces, kind of the culmination of a lot of the themes that he's been talking about through samurai films throughout his career. This is like much more of like a reflection of that, and a reflection of the era of the period pieces that he's done. To me, I liken it to Martin Scorsese with The Irishman. How The Irishman was kind of like the culmination of the gangster film for Scorsese. This was kind of the culmination of the samurai and the overall period Japanese, that kind of era that he's been dwelling in general. Is kind of the culmination of that. So it's an adaptation of Shakespeare's King Lear, and it follows like this warlord who is I believe I don't even want to try and pronounce names. As you've been, I'm sure as the listeners have been noticing, I've been carefully avoiding names throughout this entire episode. So I just don't want to be offensive. But it's about this. It's about this this emperor who's in the last years of his time trying to unite his country as he's dealing with transitioning power to his kin, to his next of kin. So overall, this is a powerful movie. It's an epic. I believe this is the only one that we've talked about so far in Kurosawa's filmography that's in color. And while it's their color, the costume designs are absolutely amazing and phenomenal and insane, and just the whole overall visual aesthetic. So John, what is your thoughts on Ran?
Ran is one of those that I came to when they reissued it in the theaters after some time after 1985. And I think it was in the 90s when they put it back out. And I remember going to seeing it, I think at the Uptown in Washington, D.C., which is where I would drive into to see these foreign films. It was like that's essentially the Cinerama Dome for Washington, D.C. is the Uptown. It was 70 millimeter. You go down and see it, and they showed it. And I drove by myself, went because nobody I knew, anybody else was a cinephile at that time amongst my friends, to the extent that they would take a drive down into DC to watch something like this. And I just remember being just in awe of the movie, just in awe of it, because like you said, it is, from what you mentioned, it is the color. The color is so vibrant. The reds are so powerful throughout the movie. And this is later Kurosawa going back to what he does best, the samurai epics, and really nailing it. I thought Kagemusha is good too, but there's something just so much more powerful about Ran than Kagemusha, and of course, framing it using the King Lear framework works so well too. A samurai warlord with 3 sons instead of the 3 daughters, like King Lear, and what happens there, and how they all come at each other, and the fool who is the king's kind of servant or king's friend, and telling him this is all going to happen, and having the king like devolve into that place of horror and shock and of how wrong he could be. And then to top it all off, you have the 16-minute or 15-minute sequence of battle that has nothing but the score. There's no screaming. There's no sound like that. There's just the score. And that battle scene, I watched it and I remember thinking to myself, I didn't know movies could do this, and I just remember that I think it was in my 20s, and I just was like, what is this? Like, this is incredible, to have seen something like this, so vibrant, so powerful. And by the time it ends, you're absolutely exhausted emotionally from what you've watched. And you feel nothing but reverence for a film like this. Yeah.
I mean, there's so much texture, like you said, so much, especially when you talk about those battle scenes, because there's nothing but extras and practicals, and I think back to another iconic moment is the fire that kind of destroys the little castle, the castle as he's sitting inside it, as he's kind of like pronouncing this cry for peace, in his final moments. It's really powerful and dynamic stuff. I personally think, and I believe this is I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, the only one of Kurosawa's films to actually win an Academy Award. If I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong, and I'm going to have to fact check that. But it won for Best Costume Design. But Kurosawa himself didn't even win an actual Academy Award, and he was nominated for Best Director. But this is the only time he had ever been nominated for Best Director for this film. So I genuinely enjoy this movie. There's this kind of sadness and amongst the reflection of it. And another tidbit, I believe Kurosawa's wife of 39 years actually passed away during the production of this movie. So you kind of see that kind of, like I said, transition of power, this grief, this kind of loss that kind of trickulates down throughout the entire film. But yeah, if people haven't seen Ran, it's honestly one of those movies that, I think is quintessential in cinema. And, like you said, John, that battle sequence alone is infamously, influential for people. And yeah, overall, this is one of those movies.
One thing, RB3, also, if you want to step out, we've talked about all these films having, pieces of Kurosawa within them. If you want to step out from this film and look at it, once again, this is Kurosawa after the suicide attempt, after the depression, coming back. I think Dersu Uzala was the one that kind of really brought him back, and then Kagemusha, and then this. But with Ron, this is the older Kurosawa. He is the King Lear character, and all those sons are the filmmakers that were influenced by him who came afterwards, and how some of them turned on him, and how some of them, and one protected him, some of them protected him, some of them burned their own house down trying to come after him. And so there was that, his commentary and rumination on his own life. I think I love that about the great directors, is they put themselves, or a version of themselves, in the movie. And I don't mean, it's almost like great painters who put themselves in their paintings. You know what I'm saying? They're just there to be a part of it. But what he does is he makes it, there's shades of it. There's enough shades of it that this is Kurosawa telling his version of his story, but it's, mixed in with all this other stuff that he's got going on in there. So it's almost like him saying, almost questioning what he built and who he handed it off to, and whether he should have. And I love that. There's no real answer to it. Only he really knew how he felt about it at the end. But this puts the idea in your head, and it's a commentary on the younger generation of filmmakers who came up after Kurosawa.
Yeah, most definitely. So I guess we'll move on to our last segment, Sabrina.
Yeah, so the last segment is like honorable mentions, kind of any film in the filmography that we haven't talked about today. So John, if you want to get us started.
Yeah, Throne of Blood is the one. I mean, that's another one. We talked about King Lear here. Throne of Blood is essentially Macbeth in samurai times. Toshiro Mifune playing the samurai warlord. Him and his friends stumble upon these three witches in the wood, and they're all in white and smoke, and they're spinning yarn while they're talking, and essentially the kabuki version of these witches, and they're speaking at high like this, and it's really spooky. He gets told he's going to be this. There's a Lady Macbeth and her wife, and they work this all out where they kill the head of the clan, and he takes over, but his friend escapes when they try to kill his friend, but they do kill his son. So I'm sorry, they kill his friend, but the son escapes, and it's all that. And so the whole thing happens, and the inventive way that they do the ending with the arrows coming at Mifune, and him, relying on the fact that no man of woman born can kill him, gets turned on its head in such an inventive way. And the idea of it's a Dunsinore wood that moves forward. The way they have the trees moving forward because the samurai army is attacking him is just magnificent. So it is on Criterion as well. It's one to definitely explore. And when you see that scene when the arrows are being shot near Mifune, those are actual archers who are shooting real arrows at those walls right by Mifune's face. It is one of the reasons that Mifune eventually will leave Kurosawa, because he felt that Kurosawa wasn't as careful with him as he felt other directors could be. So when you watch the movie, you love it, but also realize this is the next brick in the argument between these two men that will build a wall between them and essentially end their friendship. And one last thing, if you want to enjoy or examine their relationship, there's a 987-page book called The Emperor and the Wolf. It took me a year to finish that book because it is so dense. But that's, if you want to explore the Kurosawa-Mifune relationship, that is a book that I cannot recommend to you enough to read.
Yeah. That's great. That's a great one. I'm personally going to shout out another film of his that is a more contemporary set one. Came out the same year as Rashomon. Actually, it's called Scandal. Scandal is about a celebrity photographer who ends up getting caught up in like this scandalous yarn over, with a painter and a famous singer. And I think about this movie a lot because I think of people who are a little more unfamiliar with his filmography. We're trying to look for an entry point that's a little more accessible and a little more like, I think it's a little easier to digest, and it's not as like politically relevant as some of his other films are a little, or as impactful as some of his other films. But I think it does own its relevancy and his commentary on celebrityism, on his take on tabloids and media and all that kind of stuff, especially in the 1950s. And the media, in a lot of his contemporary films, the media plays a big part into his stories. I mean, we talked about High and Low. For much of the second half of the film is the main police detective kind of talking to the press and getting them to cooperate and understand what's going on. Yeah. So I appreciate that. I appreciate a lot of that on Kurosawa's filmography, and I also appreciate I think there in the documentary A Message from Kurosawa that's on Criterion Collection. He tells this story about how he was inspired to write the script because he was in a bar and a random lawyer came up to him and started like totally drunken lawyer just came up to him and started confessing everything about his life. And then Kurosawa took that moment, wrote it into a scene in this movie, which was the antithesis of the entire movie, and just went and went with it. So he took that moment that he had in real life and used it to inspire an entire movie, which I think is really awesome. So.
Yeah, the only Kurosawa movie that I've seen so far was actually The Hidden Fortress. And it was years ago because I had seen George Lucas do an interview where he talked about the influence it had on Star Wars. And as a major Star Wars fan, I was excited to check it out. And it was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it. And it's interesting because I've also heard that it's not even one of his best because his filmography is so extensive that he has so many to choose from. So like the fact that I enjoyed that one so much and, there's so much more to explore. So I'm really, really excited about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I wish I loved it more as much. I do own it in Criterion Blu-ray, but I wish I loved it more than as much as other people do. But I do appreciate it for what it influenced later, which is Star Wars. And those wipes that Lucas uses, for those of you who are too young to know this, those wipes that Lucas uses are all bit from Kurosawa. That's Kurosawa's style. That's his homage to Kurosawa. So that is not Lucas creating that. It was Kurosawa doing that in his films that influenced Lucas to do it in his. And Kurosawa even creeps into the Mandalorian behind-the-scenes documentaries that are up now on Disney+. Bryce Dallas Howard talks about the fact that she went, I think, to Japan with her father when she was like 5 years old, and Ron Howard was having a conversation with Kurosawa, and she fell asleep while they were having the conversation.
And just looking back on that later, like decades later, checking out his filmography.
Yeah, exactly.
So, fell asleep at the one chance. Yeah, well, I mean, thanks so much again to the Outlaw, my faction mate, John Rocha, for joining us on the meeting of finally.
I agree. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I was so excited to hear about Kurosawa's filmography, and I really look forward to doing a deep dive on the Criterion channel kind of during the rest of quarantine and checking out some more based on your guys' recommendations. So, John, where can the good people find you?
Oh, yeah. You guys can always find me at The Rocha Says on Twitter and on Instagram, and come and find me on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/John Rocha Says. And if you want to join my Patreon, please do so. www.patreon.com/John Rocha. I am starting on the first week of June with a patron-only show called the Criterion Corner, where every month I will take one Criterion title, break it down, talk about the special features, and give you a little in-depth insight into the film itself. And I'm sure there will be a few months where Kurosawa will be the choice of mine.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, there you have it, guys. You can find me on Twitter at Sabrina X Monica.
You can find me at Director RB3.
And on at First Cut TMO on Instagram and Twitter for the First Cut channel. So make sure you guys give this video a thumbs up and leave us some love. Thank you guys again for watching. I'm Sabrina.
This is RB3.
And special guest John Rocha, the Outlaw again. And we're peacing out.